Director of the Center for Sociological Research at the University of Johannesburg, here in studio with us. Professor, good morning and welcome to AM News.
Thank you very much.
First and foremostly, I hope that you saw the pictures of the Soweto protest. Is this new or peculiar to South Africa in terms of people baring their bottoms to protest?
Well, let me just first take issue with this word extremism, because it tends to be a word that's used to stigmatize some form of protest or some group of people. And what we're dealing with here is ordinary people, working class people, who are fed up because they're not being listened to, and they find ways of protesting. In South Africa, there have been a few examples of people baring their bottoms, women baring their bottoms, as there have been in other countries. Swaziland, we know, and indeed in Europe it's not uncommon for people to protest fully naked, men and women. So this isn't unusual, but it does reflect the fact that people have suffered from so much indignity that they feel they have to take this form of action to protest. It's not nice for people to have to do these things.
But why are people resorting to such action, do you think? Extreme action.
Well, I'm contesting this word extreme,
yes,
in part
you do.
Because you know, even if you look at the police statistics, overwhelmingly protests are peaceful protests. It's a minority of them, according to the police statistics, that are violent. And when we break down in our research these protests, the ones that are described as violence are often what we would say are disruptive. In other words, they don't involve any attack on property or on people, but they involve some holding up of traffic, which may be annoying for people, but it's not really doing any harm to people. So people are finding different ways of protesting, and mostly these are people marching along streets. Sometimes they involve tyre burning and that kind of thing. So this new bottom revealing protest is something new. Maybe it will catch on, we don't know.
Now, in your research and experience, do you think that resorting to extreme violence, for that matter, and such actions is fruitful in comparison to peaceful protest?
I don't think there's any evidence on that one way or another. But when we talk about violence, it's important to understand that this is not only rare, but it's often a response to police action on protests. And the statistics that we've gathered for the period since 2004 show about 50 protesters being killed by police. Now, I don't know of the police being killed by protesters. And so if we're to understand these protests, we have to understand underlying causes, we have to understand the issues being raised, and we have to understand the triggers that often lead to violence. And service delivery is a common issue, but it's not the only one. And one of the problems that we face is that I think the government has misread the situation. They think it's about service delivery, so they think they can deal with protests by delivering services more effectively and more quickly. Many of the issues raised are about other things. They can be about electricity cut-offs, they can be about housing, they can be about corruption, they can be about maladministration, they can be about boundary disputes and so on. So there are other issues being raised. But the underlying causes are clearly wider than that, and unemployment, we think, is a key one. If you look at the people protesting, most of them are poor. We've described this as a rebellion of the poor. And unemployment is clearly fueling the protests, both by people being bored and fed up and angry, and finding this as an outlet to try to improve their conditions. So if we're going to deal effectively with the number of protests and make sure that people are more satisfied and don't have to protest, then we have to deal with issues of unemployment, which is massive. And it's not just unemployment. Only 43% of the population have got jobs of any kind in this country. It's one of the lowest figures anywhere in the world.
Now, you mentioned triggers. Police action, could that be one of the triggers to protest action, turning violent?
Yes, we think so. I mean, and there's plenty of evidence to show that. And sometimes it's not the police being violent. Sometimes it's councillors doing things rather stupidly that then act as a trigger. So generally, protests are about injustice, people feeling wronged in some way. There are all sorts of service delivery issues, but it's when people are not being listened to that there are problems. And then people can go perhaps to a municipality and the municipal officials don't turn up, or the police are encouraged to intervene, maybe in relatively minor ways to start with. But people are responding to this kind of injustice all the time. And it happens all around the world, by the way. I mean, we're not alone in this.
Yes. Now, talking about around the world, how do we compare, though, with other countries? And I'm talking specifically right now, as we sit here. Brazil is in turmoil, protesting. How do we compare with countries like those when they protest?
Well, in terms of numbers of protests per capita, we're very high in the league as far as we can tell. And at one point, we described South Africa as the protest capital of the world. But the protests are not massive in scale, like those that we've seen in Egypt and Ukraine and so on. We haven't had that kind of city centre protest yet, and we can consider why that's the case. And I think some of it is to do with the kind of geography of our urban areas that's been left over from apartheid, so that to a large extent, poorer people are separated off in townships which, at least in the metropolitan areas, are a long way from the city centres. So this is rather different from the situation in Kiev, where I've just come from, or Istanbul, where I've just come from, or where the city centres are often more accessible. And the kind of people protesting are often more educated, more middle class, let's say, kinds of people who have access to city centres. And those protests are, as we know, often really massive. I mean, the largest protests that have ever been in Ukrainian history, Turkish history, Egyptian history have occurred in the recent past.
Now, more often than not, criminal elements take advantage of so-called violent protests and the situation where we're witnessing looting and destruction of property. And how does this now compromise the legitimacy of issues raised by the protesters and the community?
Well, you say more often than not, as if this is well-established fact, and it's not.
It's not.
I mean, I was saying to you earlier that, in fact, overwhelmingly, protests are peaceful. I think what we have is a situation where the media, not surprisingly, pick up on the more violent protests, and this can give a false impression of what protest activity is like. And we have to watch out for that, because sometimes it can then lead to the police justifying more violent intervention or justifying increased expenditure, which is what happened after the protests in February. Now, the public have to decide whether that's right or not, but they have to decide on the basis of accurate evidence, which is what we're trying to provide for people. And in our view, there was an exaggeration in terms of the numbers of protests that occurred earlier this year. They were high compared to previous months, but they weren't the highest on record. And this year they look as if there are going to be more protests than in previous years if we continue on at the same rate, but not very much higher than in the past. So we need to kind of keep things in proportion here.
Compare apples to apples.
Quite so.
Professor, thank you so much for your time and joining us here on AM News.
Thank you.
That was Professor Peter Alexander, who is the Director of the Centre for Sociological Research at the University of Johannesburg.